Hey all, today I'll be going through using the Forecasting Growth Models Toolbox. So the first thing you're going to want to do is navigate over to this GitHub page link, which is also included in the tutorial paper. This page contains all the necessary code and data needed to be able to follow along with this tutorial, along with use this toolbox on your own data or with your own data. So within this README section, which is also all of this information down below, you can find a basic overview of the features included within the toolbox, along with installation requirements, a simple walkthrough of the main features of the toolbox, and publications where the models in the toolbox were employed. Here, so this Forecasting Growth Models code folder. This folder contains all the necessary MATLAB functions needed to be able to use the toolbox, along with a preloaded input and output folders. So you will see some things included in these folders, which we'll go over in a little bit. So the input folder comes preloaded with one data set, which is the most recent time series US CDC data set, which contains weekly mpox data for the United States and is the data which will be used throughout the duration of this tutorial. The output folder comes preloaded with a few files as well, so these are similar to what we will see upon completion of the tutorial today. Next, to download the folder containing all of the code and the data we're going to need, we want to click on this green code button here, and then click Download Zip. So the folder then is downloaded as a zip folder to your computer's download folder. As I have a Windows operating system, this goes to my downloads folder, but it may differ depending on your computer. So the next thing you're going to want to do is find where that zip file went to when you downloaded it. So for me, that is my downloads right here. And then what you're going to want to do is navigate to the screen that shows the folder called Forecasting Growth Models Code. So you're going to want to click on that zip folder and then click through some folder options here until you get to this Forecasting Growth Models Code folder, and you'll also see the readme.md file. Next, what you're going to want to do is right-click on this folder, hit copy, and then you're going to want to navigate to the folder in your personal computer where you want to host the toolbox and any associated outputs and inputs. For me, I'm going to have that in my desktop. I have already moved this folder here, so I'm not going to do that now, but that is what you would do to be able to get the folder where you need it to be. So once you've successfully reached this point, you're ready to start exploring the contents of the toolbox. First, we're going to take a look at the data to be used for today's tutorial. So the original data that was used in this tutorial contains weekly incidence, or the weekly incidence curve of mpox or monkeypox cases reported in the US, published by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, for the week of May 12, 2022 through December 15, 2022. I have this file already in Excel for us to take a look at. However, for the purposes of this toolbox, instead of using dates, our first column here corresponds to the time index and starts at 0. Here we can see we have 32 weeks of data, as the first week, or May 12, 2022, corresponds to a time index of 0. And then our last week of data, or December 15, 2022, corresponds to a time index of 31, meaning in total we have 32 weeks of data. The second column corresponds to the temporal incidence data, or in this case, reported mpox cases. The second column could also contain cumulative incident count data, and if working with cumulative incident count data, the name of the time series data must start with cumulative. Otherwise, there is no requirement for how the file is named. And in this case, we have it named most recent time series US CDC because we are not working with cumulative data. If working with cumulative data, again, we would need to make sure we have the word cumulative at the start of our file name. So before saving the data as well, make sure there are no column headers or labels. As seen here, we just have the numbers for the time index and the cases themselves. Once you've gotten to this point, you're ready to save your data. So the data needs to be saved as a TXT file within the input file of the toolbox. I've already done this, so I'll just do a quick walkthrough of how to do it, but not do it myself. So what you'll want to do is click on File and then Save As. And then you're going to want to navigate to the input folder within the toolbox code. And then you're going to want to save it as a TXT. So in this case, it's got to be the text tab delimited. As this file already comes preloaded, we do not need to resave the data. However, if you're working with your own data, make sure you save it with that TXT extension within the input folder of your toolbox. Finally, before navigating over to MATLAB, let's take a look at the final input data that comes preloaded and what will be used for the duration of the tutorial. So here we can see we have the same two columns as explored in the Excel file, so our time index and then our incident count data. So now that we've explored the proper format and data to be used for this tutorial, and then with any data for future uses of the toolbox, we're ready to open MATLAB. So to open MATLAB, first thing you're going to want to do is navigate to the MATLAB icon on your personal computer and open the application. I already have mine open, so let's do that. Once MATLAB is opened, you'll then want to navigate to the working directory or the location or folder where you save the toolbox code and where all of your data and where you want to output is. And then you're going to want to set this as your working directory. So there's a couple different ways you can do this. Like, for example, for me, because I have everything saved within my desktop, what I can do in this left-hand panel is click Desktop. And then I have my forecast and growth models code. I can right-click. And then let me remove this from the path. I can go in and click Add to Path. And then selected folders and subfolders. And then open that up. So now that means that everything in the code in the folder we downloaded is now in our working directory. If you have a hard time finding location where the toolbox is saved, you can also click on this folder icon here, so with the green arrow, and then navigate to the correct location via this method. And then the steps to add the folder to your working directory are the same. And then to double check that the working directory or pathway is set correctly, you can make sure this bar up here points to the folder which contains your code. Now that you have your working directory set, you're ready to start selecting the parameters to fit the model and obtain the effective reproduction number. So the first thing you're going to want to do is open this options fit file. So prior to fitting the model to data we looked at earlier, we must specify parameters related to the model fitting within this file. The parameters specified here will be used with fitting the model to data, calculating the effective reproduction number, and examining doubling times for the observed data. So the first section we need to take a look at is related to the properties of the data set. So this section right here. Here we see three user parameters, so CAD file name 1, CAD disease, and then data type. This CAD file name 1 is a string variable indicating the name of the data file containing the time series data of interest. As we discussed earlier, for the purposes of this tutorial, we are working with MPOX data saved under the file name most recent time series US CDC. So what we'll do is change this file name to represent that. You do not need to include the TXT extension here, only the name of the file. Next, the cat disease parameter is a string variable indicating the name of the disease or subject related to the time series data. For this example, this is listed as monkeypox as we're working with monkeypox or mpox data. And throughout this tutorial today, you'll hear me refer to it as both monkeypox or mpox. Finally, this data type parameter is a string variable indicating the nature of the data. For example, as we're working with mpox cases for this tutorial, we indicate this by having the parameter equal to the string cases. One thing that's important to note with all three of these parameters, each of the responses needs to be in single quotation marks. In this next section here, so parameter estimation, you specify user parameters related to the model parameter estimation method, error structure, and the bootstrapping procedures. First, this method one parameter is a user-specified parameter integer variable indicating the parameter estimation method employed during model fitting. There are multiple estimation methods available, as seen here. However, for now, we're going to employ a nonlinear least squares estimation method. To indicate this within the code, we're going to have our method one parameter equal to 0. So as we can see here for nonlinear least squares, this is equal to 0. So let me change that. However, if we wanted to employ a different estimation method, we would change the 0 in the appropriate, or change the 0 to the appropriate number to match the desired method. Next is dist1 variable. This is a user-specified parameter indicating the error structure assumption to be employed during model fitting. So similar to the method one parameter, there are multiple error structures available, as you can see here. However, for now, we want to employ a normal error structure as indicated with our dist1 equal to 0. So let me change this to 0. Like above, if we wanted to employ a different error structure, we just need to change that 0 to an appropriate number. One thing to note, when selecting the estimation method and error structure, make sure they match as indicated within the comments of the MATLAB code. For example, if we wanted to work with MLE Poisson, we would need to make sure that we are using the correct error structure down here. And the comments here can be used to help make sure you're matching those up correctly. The next user parameter is the num start points parameter. So this defines the number of different initial guesses for the optimization procedure using the multi-start feature in MATLAB. Meaning it represents the number of random initial guesses of the model parameters. Here we're using 10 to thoroughly search for the best fit parameters. And then the final parameter in this section is B. And this is a parameter indicating the number of bootstrap realizations utilized to characterize parameter uncertainty. And for this tutorial, we have this set to 300. In our next section here, so this growth models, we specify parameters related to the growth model fit to the data and the initial conditions we want to use for model fitting. So flag one here is our first user parameter we need to specify. And this is where we specify the growth model that will be fit to the time series data. As you can see above, so up here, we have multiple options to choose from. So to start, we're going to be fitting a generalized logistic growth model. So this is indicated by having this flag one equal to 1. So this GLM option. However, later in this tutorial, we will also fit a Richards model to the data, which would indicate by making flag one equal to 4 for Richards. However, we can also use the name of the model instead of the number. So unlike before, we do not need to use single quotations here. But if we wanted to continue using the GLM model, we can either put 1 or GLM. And that applies to the other growth models available here. Next, we have our model name one parameter. So this is where we indicate the name of the model. As this is a string variable here, the number of the corresponding model must be in single quotations or single parentheses for this parameter. Since we're employing a generalized logistic model, we have our model named GLM here. And one thing to note too, you can know if you have those closed parentheses or have a string if the item you want to be a string has turned purple, as you can see here. And then finally, this fixed IO, this is where we specify the initial condition of our model. Therefore, this parameter is a Boolean variable or a 0-1 variable, indicating whether the initial value in the time series will be estimated or fixed according to the first data point in the time series. So for the purposes of this tutorial, we'll be estimating the initial value of the time series as indicated with the 0 here. So let me change that. If we did not want to estimate the initial value of the time series and rather have it fixed according to that first data point, we would change fixed IO to 1. So finally, we need to specify the parameters of our rolling window analysis or the calibration periods we will be fitting our model to. First, our window size 1 is an integer variable indicating the moving window or calibration period size. To start, we're interested in fitting the model to all available data. So in this case, we had 32 weeks of available data. We'll change that to 32. Next, our T_start1 is where we indicate the time point for the starting rolling window or start of the rolling window analysis. As we're only interested in fitting the model to all available data, we have this set to 1. So this means our first calibration period or rolling window will start in week 1 of the available data. Next, next is our T_end1 variable. This is where we indicate the time point in which to end the rolling window analysis. Again, as we're interested in fitting the model to all available data, we set this T_end1 parameter to 1. This indicates that we want our first and last calibration period to start from the first week of available data and then be 32 weeks in length. However, if we wanted to fit multiple calibration periods shorter in length than 32 weeks, we could adjust the T_start1 parameter and T_end1 parameter to reflect the number of calibration periods we wish to fit. For example, if we were working with a 30-week calibration period, we could set our T_start1 to 1, indicating we want our first calibration period to start at the first week of data, so we could change that to 1. And include 30 weeks of MPOX data, so we would change our window size to 30. And then if we want to fit multiple rolling windows, we could adjust our T_end1 to equal 2. So what that means is we would fit data to the first 30 weeks of the data. And then we would fit a second calibration period starting in week 2, would contain 30 weeks of data, and then end at week 31 rather than week 30. So it's a shift in the calibration period. If T_end1 were equal to 3 here, we would have 3 total calibration periods to be fit. The first one starting at 1 and ending at 30. The second one starting at week 2 and ending at week 31. And then the third one ending at week 3, starting in week 3 and ending in week 32. We'll look at the output from a rolling window analysis later in this tutorial. Now that the options related to fitting the model have been specified, the next thing we're going to want to do is provide some information regarding the generational interval distribution and the mean and variance of the distribution to be used when estimating the effective reproduction number. To do this, we're going to need our options_RT file. And if you are not interested in estimating the effective reproduction number or working with data where it's not applicable, you can skip this step. However, if you are interested in fitting the effective reproduction number, you will want to do this step before fitting your model. So this first parameter here is where we specify the type of distribution we want to use for the generation. interval. So we have three options to choose from here: a gamma, exponential, and delta distributions. For this tutorial, we're interested in using a gamma distribution. Therefore, we have our type GID1 parameter equal to 1. If we wanted to change the type of distribution we are using, we can change our parameter here to equal the appropriate number. Next, we need to specify the mean of the generation interval distribution. So as we're using MPOX data for this tutorial, the estimated mean of the generation interval distribution is 1.78, and this number comes from past literature related to the MPOX epidemic from which this data came from. And then finally, we need to specify the variance of the generation interval distribution. Again, as we're using the weekly MPOX data for this tutorial, the estimated variance of the generation interval distribution is going to be set to 0.65 weeks squared. Here we would indicate that by 0.65. Now that the options related to fitting the model and estimating the effective reproduction number, if applicable, has been specified, the next step is to check that the code works properly with the simulated data before the toolbox is applied to actual data. That is, if we can estimate the true parameter values used to generate simulated data from the model, then we can confidently move forward that the code is working appropriately with simulated data. So to do this, we can employ the plot growth models .m function. So this function right here. So the function uses a call of the following. So what you would do is go down to your command window, type in plot growth model. And then first we want to indicate the type of growth model. And as we're using a generalized logistic growth model here, this first parameter is equal to 1, which is our flag parameter we also specified in the options fit file. Next, we want to specify our R parameter because this is estimated with the GLM model. So here we're going to use a value of 0.18. And we specify our P, which is 0.9. And then the next parameter here corresponds to the A parameter. And you can see this here with this pop-up. We have our flag 1, our R, our P, and now MATLAB's telling us here that we need a parameter. And in this case, since this model does not estimate A, we can indicate this with brackets. And these need to be square brackets. And then finally, we need to specify our K or epidemic size. So we're going to have this set to 10,000. And then our initial condition will be set to 1. And then followed by the duration of the simulation, which will be 200 here. And remember, again, these values correspond to the tutorial we're doing today. So to run this function, again, we're going to run this call and then look at the output of the representative simulation from the GLM model we just specified. And to run, what we can do is just make sure our cursor's down here and then click enter, and we'll let this run for a moment. And here we have our graph pulled up, which again is a representative simulation from our GLM model. So next, what we're going to do is fit the GLM model to the data. So first, we're going to fit and plot a GLM model to all weeks of MPOX data, and then we'll briefly look how we could do the same for the Richards model. So to do so, what we first need to do is close these tabs out. And don't worry, your options that you send the option _ fit and options _ RT will be saved. If you are worried though, you can also save this. So the next thing we're going to want to do is use the run fit growth models function. So we're going to want to open that up. So there are two different ways we can run this. First, we can run it as is. So what that means is just click run and have this run. Second, we can run this using a function call similar to what we just did. This function call takes the parameters of the rolling window analysis and then the rest from the options files we specified earlier. So the call for this function, what we would type here is run fit growth models. And then as we're interested in fitting the data to all 32 weeks of data, similar to what we did with our rolling window analysis before, we would say we want a T start of 1, a T end of 1, and then a window size of 32. And as we did with the plot growth models, all we would do is click enter. However, for the sake of time, I am not going to run this as it does take a while to run. And we're going to take a look at the figure that is produced when you would run this code. So here's the figure you would get with running the code here. So the figure shows the fit of the GLM model to the entire incidence curve of mpox data. So overall, we can see the model provides a good fit to the entire incidence curve. Looking down here, the model supports sub-exponential growth dynamics as indicated by our P parameter and has a growth rate estimated between 1.6 and 2.2 as indicated here. The epidemic size parameters, so K here, was estimated between 28,000 and 30,000 cases. And here the scaling parameter A is not estimated when employing the GLM. Therefore, this value is just at 1. It is not estimated at all. So looking first, these horizontal dashed lines here and each of these top panels shows the range of the 95% CIs of the parameter estimations. In this bottom panel, the solid red line here, so in the center of the gray is the median model fit. These dashed lines correspond to the 95% prediction intervals. The blue dots are the observed data points. This gray here, which is close to the red line, corresponds to the mean of the model fits obtained from the parametric bootstrapping with 300 bootstrap realizations. And then the cyan or blue lines here indicate the predictive uncertainty around the model fit. This code outputs just this graph, which we'll see this quite a bit throughout the rest of the tutorial in different forms. And then we'll also get quite a few MATLAB files, which you don't need to worry about now, but those will be used when you go to plot the fit and get some information regarding the model fit, parameter estimations, calibration performance, and doubling times. And we'll go over that in a moment. So after fitting the model, we can then use the plot fit growth models function to display the model fit in the empirical distribution of the parameters. So let's open that up. So this function also saves CSV files in the output folder with the model fit, the parameter estimates with the 95% confidence intervals, the calibration performance metrics, and the estimated doubling times of the incidence trajectory. To run this, it's similar to the run fit. We can do this in two different ways, either running directly from hitting run, or we can use a function call down here. So if we wanted to use the function call, we would type plot fit growth models, and then the parameters it takes here are again related to the rolling window analysis. So we are fitting data to the to the 32 weeks of data we have, or fitting the model to 32 weeks of data that we have. So we set our T start to 1, our T end to 1, and our window size to 32. And then we would click enter to run. For the purposes of this analysis, we will not run this again to save some time. However, let's take a look at the figures we would get. So again, we would get the same figure, which we've already gone over, and then we would also get quite a few different CSV files in our output folder, which you would see with running this. Again, this is related to the model fit, the model parameter estimates, our calibration performance metrics, and our doubling times. And you can discern which files are related to which by looking at the file names. It's clearly delimited within the file names to indicate what's contained within each. So we can also use the toolbox to plot the temporal sequence of parameter estimates and their uncertainty obtained from the rolling window analysis whenever the value of the parameter tn1 is greater than the parameter tstart1. So meaning we can run multiple calibration periods simultaneously or one after another. So for instance, after running the function run fit growth models with the following parameter estimates, so if we wanted to do run fit growth models starting at week 1, and this time we're going to change this to 3. So what that would mean, as we talked about earlier, we would have 3 calibration periods fit. So one from week 1 to week 30, and then week 2 to week 31, and then week 3 to week 32. So we would have models fit to each of those calibration periods, and then we could run our plot fit growth models with those same parameters and obtain a rolling window analysis plot in addition to what we just discussed. Again, for the sake of the time, I will not run this code now. Rather, we'll take a look at the additional figure output. So the top panel here shows the monkeypox epidemic curve in the US for reference, so we can see a plot of cases. And then this bottom panel shows the temporal sequence of parameter estimates. So the red line here is our parameter estimates, and their 95% confidence intervals are provided with the blue dashed lines around that. And this corresponds to the 3 different time or moving time windows. So the 1 to 30 week, the 2 to 31 week, and then the 3 to 32 or 3 to 32 weeks. So our first, our second, then our third. And then again, this A parameter is not estimated as we're working with a generalized logistic model. But we do get our parameter estimates at each rolling window analysis, so our 3 for our R, our P, and our K parameters. So that is a quick overview of fitting the model. We can repeat this as well for the Richards model pretty easily. So how we would do that is we would go to our options fit. And then instead of having GLM in 1 here, we would just change that to 4 enrich. Then we could repeat all of that again. I will not do this now, but let's take a quick look at the graphical output we would get with running the Richards model. As you can see, we have one slight change here. So before we were getting an estimate for our P, and now we're getting one for our A. That is because the Richards model does not include that P or gross scalar parameter in its estimate, or does not estimate that parameter. Rather, it uses A as a growth parameter and estimates that. And then we have our R parameter and our K parameter as normal. Overall as well, looking at this graph down here, it looks pretty similar in terms of 95% prediction interval coverage as well. So the toolbox can also be used to produce forecasts employing growth models, not just fitting growth models to data. So first, as we did with fitting the model, we also need to specify parameters related to the model fitting and forecasting within the options forecast.m file. So similar as before, we have many of the same parameters here. So our CAD file, CAD disease, data type, all of our parameter estimation information is the same. Our growth model is the same. So again, we're going to be sticking with that GLM or the generalized logistic model here. However, we do have a new section of parameters here now related to forecasting. So here we do need to specify what we want in terms of forecasts. And then also after that, we'll make some changes in the rolling window analysis. So this first parameter here, this get performance, this is a parameter or is a flag or indicator variable to calculate the forecasting performance. If this is marked as a 1, we do want to calculate the forecasting performance. If it is a 0, we do not. So for example, for the purposes of this tutorial, we will be fitting data to the first 10 weeks, or fitting the model to the first 10 weeks of data, and then forecasting out 4 weeks. As we have 32 weeks of data, we do have the observed data available to evaluate our forecast. Therefore, we can mark as 1. However, let's say we wanted to fit to the last 10 weeks of data that we have, and then forecast out 4 weeks. We would not know what happened during those 4-week out forecasts. Therefore, we could not evaluate our performance metrics, and this would need to be marked as a 0. Second, we have our forecasting period. So the second parameter here. This is where we indicate the number of forecasting horizons we want to forecast ahead. In this case, we want to forecast 4 weeks ahead. Therefore, we are going to set this equal to 4. If you are working with daily data, this 4 here would represent 4 days. But as we're working with weekly data and we specify, or as we're working with weekly data, this is corresponding to 4 weeks out. So finally, before we move on to forecasting, we need to adjust our rolling window analysis to fit the model to the first 10 weeks of data and the first 10 weeks of data alone. Therefore, our rolling window analysis is going to be set to 10 to say we want to only fit 10 weeks of data. And then our T-start 1 is going to equal 1. And our TN1 is going to equal 1, meaning we just want to fit those first 10 weeks of data and then forecast based on that model fit. So to generate a forecast, next what we're going to use is the run forecasting growth models function. So let's open that up. Similar as before, there are 2 different ways we can run this. So if we ran as is, it pulls all the parameters that we just specified in the options forecast M file. However, like before, we can also use a function call, and it takes in the parameters of our T-start1, our T-end1, and our window size, so our rolling window analysis for this parameter, and an additional parameter corresponding to the forecasting period. And everything else regarding model fitting, bootstrapping, that would be pulled from our options forecast M file. So the call we would use here would be run forecasting growth models. And then we are working with the first 10 weeks. So that's our rolling window analysis parameters. And then we want to forecast out 4 weeks, so we would indicate that with a 4 there. And for the sake of this tutorial, we are not going to run this code. However, the function, if we were to run this, we would generate a single model fit and store several output MATLAB files related to the model fit in forecasting, parameter estimations, and the calibration and forecasting performance metrics. We'll also generate a figure with the model fit and the 4-week ahead forecast and corresponding empirical distributions of the parameters. So again, as we're not running this, we are not going to take a look at the real-time execution, but we are going to look at what figures we would get outputted. So this is very similar to what we've been looking at. We have our parameter or the parameters up top. Again, as we're working with the GLM model, we are not estimating that a parameter. And overall, what this figure is telling us is that the model fit is pretty consistent with early exponential growth dynamics. So our P is decently close to 1 here, with that range being 0.73 to 0.94. It has an estimated growth rate between 0.73 and 0.94. Oh, I'm sorry, our P here is 0.96 to 1. I misspoke earlier. And our R, which is our growth rate, is between 0.73 and 0.94. the epidemic size parameter here, so K, was estimated between this range here. And then our scaling parameter, or A, again, is not estimated because we're employing a GLM. Looking down here, oh, I apologize. Looking here first, this horizontal dash line shows the range of the 95% confidence intervals of the parameter estimates. And then in this bottom panel, the solid red line, again, is our median model fit. The dashed lines correspond to our 95% prediction intervals, and our blue dots indicate the observed data points. This gray band, which I know a little bit difficult to see, is the mean of the model fits obtained from the parametric bootstrapping with 300 bootstrap realizations. And then the cyan or blue lines indicate the predictive uncertainty around the model fit. So all of this we've seen before. However, as we are forecasting, we do have a little bit of some new output. This vertical dash line here is what separates our 10-week calibration period on the left and our 4-week ahead forecasting period on our right. So what we can see is our blue dots are observed, and then we have our median forecast and then the associated prediction intervals associated with that forecast. And then we have our cyan lines again, indicating the predictive uncertainty around the model fit. Now, as you can see, our model did underpredict in terms of forecasting what actually happened. So once we've executed this function, so run forecasting growth models function, we can then use the plot forecast growth models function. So let's open that up. To plot the model-based forecast and the performance metrics of the forecast. And these performance metrics we would get are our mean squared error, mean absolute error, 95% prediction intervals, and our weighted interval scores. And again, we can run this 2 different ways. So we can run this as is, so have this going and click run. Or we can use a function call like we've been doing with everything else today. So that function call takes in the same parameters as the run forecasting growth models function. So our t_start1, our t_end1 in our window size, along with our forecasting period. With our remaining inputs, so again, related to bootstrapping, our growth models, everything else from that options forecast file. So the call here would be plot forecast growth models.m. I'm sorry, plot forecast growth models. Then our t_start1 of 1, our t_end1 of 1. And then we're fitting to the first 10 weeks of data. So this would be 10. And then we want to forecast out 4 weeks. So that would be 4. And again, you would run this file after you've run the plot forecasting growth models. So what this file would output is data associated with the forecast, the parameter estimations, the calibration and forecasting performance metrics, and the doubling times of the entire model trajectory, including the forecasting period. And these are saved as CSV files in the output folder. And again, like before, the file names make it pretty clear which files go with which metrics or with what information. So for the sake of time, so this tutorial is not super long, we will not run this code now, but let's take a look at the graphs that are outputted. So we get the same graph, and as we've gone over it before, we're not going to go through it again in detail. And then we get a second graph here, which shows our forecasting metrics at each time point in the 4-week out forecasting period. So as you can see, we have our 1 week out, 2, 3, and 4. And we get one of these graphs for each of our metrics. So our mean absolute error, our mean squared error, our weighted interval score, and then our 95% prediction interval. And then we get those CSV files as well, which provide the numerical equivalent of this figure, along with information regarding our forecast, doubling times, everything else we got with running the plot model fit function. So the last thing we're going to cover today is related to reducing the effective reproduction number. So earlier, if you recall, we specified some information regarding the distribution, mean, and variance of the generation interval. So let's take a look at that again. So we've already specified this information, so we do not need to do this again. And since we've already fit the model using the run fit growth models function, we are all set to plot our reproduction number. So what we would do here is open our plot fit reproduction number. So let me open that up. And then we can run this two separate ways. So we can either run as is or run with a function call. So the function call here would be plot forecast. I'm sorry, wrong file. Plot fit reproduction number. And then this takes in the parameters of our rolling window analysis. So our T start of one, T end of one. And as you can recall earlier when we were fitting the model, we fit to all 32 weeks of data. So we're going to go back to having a window size of 32. Again, we're not going to run this right now, but let's talk briefly about the output we would get. So we would get a graphical display of the effective reproduction number, which we'll look at momentarily. And then we would also get multiple CSV files in the output folder, which would include information regarding our effective reproduction number, the model fit like before, parameter estimations with their 95% confidence intervals, calibration performance metrics, and also the estimated doubling times of the incident trajectory. So with running this, what you get in addition to all the files we were getting before is now a CSV file containing information about that effective reproduction number. Looking at the graphical output we get here, you can see we have two different things going on. So this top figure here shows our model fit for the 32 weeks, and everything's the same as before in terms of the dots being the blue dots here being our observed data. The red is our median model fit. We have our dashed lines, which are 95% prediction intervals. Then we have our gray and cyan or blue lines as before. And then down below, we get our mean effective reproduction number at each time point, along with their associated confidence intervals. And then the dashed line at 1 here represents that cutoff of 1, which is commonly used with the effective reproduction number. So we can also use or forecast that effective reproduction number using the plot forecast reproduction number function. So you can use this after running the run forecast growth model. So like before, where you had to run the run fit growth models to be able to run the plot fit reproduction number to forecast a reproduction number, you would have already had to run the run forecasting growth models function, which we discussed earlier. Again, two different ways of running this. So running as is, which would pull information from that options forecast and from the options RT files. Or we can use a function call. So the function call here, similar as before, would be plot, forecast, and then reproduction number. So we would have information regarding what we forecast before. So remember, in forecasting, we use 10 weeks of data rather than 32. So I changed our rolling window size to 10. And then we were forecasting out 4 weeks, so we would indicate that here with a 4. Again, I'm not going to run this now, but the output we would get or we would get some graphical output from this, and then we would also get similar CSV files to what we discussed before, along with our forecasted reproduction numbers. And those would those CSV files would be exported to your output folder. And finally, in terms of graphical output, very similar to what we were looking at before. We have our forecasts up here for our model fit. So we have our model fit and then our 4-week out forecast. And then below we have our forecasted effective reproduction number with our mean forecast and then the associated confidence intervals. So that is all there is with this toolbox. There's a lot of flexibility with what you can do. And that is all that I have. Thank you.